Our first witness is Jenna Orkin. And Jenna Orkin is a member of the World Trade Center Environmental Organization, and she's going to be testifying to the air toxicity in Lower Manhattan and the response of the government in the wake of 9/11 relative to the air quality, given the all clear. So Jenna Orkin will give a 15-minute presentation, or up to 15 minutes, and then there'll be Q&A. Actually, then we'll go to John Judge with a staff statement about the 9/11 omission report, and then we'll go to question session. So Jenna Orkin. And we'll now go to a swearing in, which is something the 9/11 Commission did not do early on in its proceedings.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm about to do something that at least I know Condoleezza Rice was running away from. Do you swear to tell the truth before this commission?
Yes.
See, it was so simple.
I want to make sure to get two things in before I start. One is I am a plaintiff in a potential class action lawsuit against EPA. Two is my website for World Trade Center Environmental Organization, WTCEO.org. September 11th was a tragedy that has changed the course of history and the way we live. It was also an environmental disaster of historic proportions. The way the federal government has handled this aspect of 9/11 has been passive at best. At worst, it rises to a level of reckless endangerment that entails lies stemming from the White House itself. From the beginning, independent scientists and other experts have uncovered data and testified on the dangers of the air downtown. The response of the EPA and via the domino effect of city and state agencies has been contradictory. On the one hand, they protest, this was unprecedented. What did you expect us to do? On the other hand, they claim there's no problem. The fact remains that to this day, there has been no adequate testing or cleanup, and there are no plans in place for the comprehensive health care that will be necessary to cover the broad spectrum of illnesses, not only respiratory, but also neurological, endocrinological, etc., which will manifest themselves in decades to come. In short, in the environmental aftermath of 9/11, Osama bin Laden could not have found a more felicitous collaborator than George W. Bush. The World Trade Center was a city with its own zip code. It contained approximately 50,000 computers, each made with between 4 and 12 pounds of lead. The first 40 stories of at least one of the towers was coated with hundreds of tons of asbestos, which was pulverized to particles of unusually small size and dispersed around Lower Manhattan, as well as possibly to Brooklyn and beyond. Tens of thousands of fluorescent light bulbs, each contained enough mercury to contaminate a quarter of a city block. The smoke detectors contained radioactive americium-241. The U.S. EPA found levels of polychlorinated biphenyls at 75,000 times the previous record. That's my calculation. We can talk later about it. Dioxin also reached record levels. The alkalinity of the air was equivalent to that of drain cleaner. A month after the disaster, scientists from the University of California at Davis found the highest levels of vanadium and other heavy metals and variant ultrafine particles that they had ever recorded out of 7,000 samples taken around the world, including at the burning Kuwaiti oil fields. The EPA did not measure particles of this size. In addition, there were all the other contaminants one might expect to find when a modern city burns. Dr. Marjorie Clark of Hunter College has testified that the World Trade Center disaster was equivalent to dozens of asbestos factories, incinerators, and crematoria, as well as a volcano. Nevertheless, starting on September 13th, the EPA issued reassuring statements about the air quality downtown. At hearings conducted in February and March of 2002, EPA Ombudsman Robert Martin and his chief investigator Hugh Kaufman accused EPA Administrator Christy Todd Whitman of lying in part to protect her husband's holdings in Citigroup, the owner of major insurers of Lower Manhattan. The accusation that the EPA had actively lied was recently corroborated by a memo uncovered by EPA scientist Dr. Kate Jenkins, which revealed that at the time of Whitman's statements, EPA already had test results showing asbestos that exceeded the agency's regulation levels. A report by the EPA Inspector General in August of 2003 had said that Whitman's reassurances were premature, but had stopped short of accusing her of lying. However, it revealed that EPA's initial press releases, which cautioned the public about the levels of asbestos in the air and dust, had been revised by the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Cautionary statements about asbestos were deleted and replaced by reassurances. Why did the Council on Environmental Quality interfere in this way? The report stated, the desire to reopen Wall Street played a role in EPA's air quality statements. EPA also made statements about 1% asbestos, and it would be interesting if you asked about that in the Q&A. It was highly deceptive the way they used that standard. EPA was also able to report low readings for certain contaminants by using outdated equipment. An article by Andrew Schneider in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on January 14th of 2002 quotes Dr. Jenkins to the effect that for every asbestos fiber EPA found, independent contractors found 9. The risk of cancer from asbestos could be as high as 1 person in 10. EPA Region 8, which had been in charge of an asbestos cleanup in Libby, Montana, offered Region 2 in New York access to up-to-date equipment. According to Dr. Jenkins' memo of July 4th, 2003, Region 2 replied, "We don't want you fucking cowboys here. The best thing they could do would be assign you to Alaska." With the green light from EPA, Lower Manhattan reopened for residents, offices, and students. Ground Zero workers were often told that since the air was safe, they didn't need to wear respirators. Some, such as Lieutenant Manuel Gomez, were explicitly forbidden to wear a respirator on the grounds that it might frighten the public. Residents returned to their homes, some of which looked like Pompeii. But since EPA had declared the air to be safe, insurance companies often refused to pay for professional abatement. Businesses faced the same dilemma. And since EPA had handed jurisdiction over indoor air to city agencies, residents were obliged to turn to the New York City Department of Health, which recommended that to clean up the dust in their apartments, people use a wet mop or a wet rag. If the dust was really bad, said DOH, they should wear long pants. The Red Cross distributed buckets to assist in what was being portrayed as a piece of mundane, if heavy-duty, house cleaning. DOH also cautioned residents to lower curtains slowly so as to dislodge as little dust as possible. But they said that children and pregnant women need take no extra precautions. Tenants threw out tons of contaminated debris by themselves. Some wore respirators, but were not informed that they were supposed to change the filters, so the respirators were useless after a day or so. On October 9th, Stuyvesant High School, where my son was a student, opened to much fanfare about showing the terrorists. School's Chancellor Harold Levy set up a bivouac office at the school, telling parents, "If I thought it wasn't safe, would I be here myself?" A fresh woman, whom I shall call Anne, told Levy she was worried and wanted to transfer out at least while the fires burned. Levy said, "If you leave now, you can't come back." 4 days later, Levy himself left, later telling a TV interviewer, "Parents should focus instead on whether their children are having safe sex or wearing seatbelts." In the past 3 years, Anne has had 2 spinal taps to relieve the buildup of fluid pressure in her brain, a condition known as pseudotumor cerebri. For the next 8 months, after October 9th, Stuyvesant, Borough of Manhattan Community College, which was home to 17,000 students, and Independence Plaza, a housing complex of 5,000, got a double whammy of toxic waste. Not only did they have the World Trade Center site to the south, but also at Stuyvesant's north doorstep, and next to its ventilation intakes sat the waste transfer barge which transported the toxic debris to Staten Island. Ordinarily, this placement would have been in violation of state and federal laws, but for the 8 months of cleanup, emergency conditions prevailed. The barge operation also prevented evacuation in the event of another disaster downtown. The kids would have to evacuate south towards it. The barge station, which operated 24/7, played host to a diesel crane and idling diesel trucks which were only intermittently covered and wetted down as they bore their toxic cargo through the streets. Recently, EPA itself has advocated stronger legislation curtailing diesel emissions, particularly in stationary vehicles, as diesel has been found to contain myriad carcinogens and toxic air contaminants. In part as a result of the barge operation, for half the days until February at the Stuyvesant Monitoring Station, particulate matter 2.5, dust that is small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs and not come out again, was above EPA regulatory levels. Often it was higher at Stuyvesant than at ground zero. Because it has a relatively large surface area to volume ratio, and that's because it's so small, PM 2.5 also adsorbed onto its surface whatever toxic chemicals were in the debris. On occasion, isocyanates and tetrachloroethane and asbestos also exceeded EPA limits, and high levels of lead were found in the gym where the lead could be inhaled deeply, and in the cafeteria where it could settle on students' food. Little is known about the synergistic effect of these contaminants, but Dr. Stephen Levin of Mount Sinai has pointed out that if someone is an asbestos worker and a smoker, for instance, the effect is not simply twice as bad as being one or the other, it's 80 or 90 times as bad. A major shield against these pollutants, Stuyvesant's filtration system was approximately 10% effective until the end of January, when at the insistence of the Parents Association, it was upgraded to 40% effectiveness. In addition, after the school reopened, parents and staff learned that in the course of the school's supposed asbestos abatement, the ventilation system had not been cleaned. At this point, the chronology is going to become very simplified. Even after FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, allocated $20 million to clean the Ground Zero schools, the Board of Education refused to clean Stuyvesant's ventilation system or do wipe tests on the grounds that there was no problem. Finally, parents, using the pro bono services of Stuyy alumnus and attorney Richard Benveniste of Watergate and now 9/11 Commission fame, threatened to sue. The Board of Ed performed the wipe tests, which showed 30 times the level of lead one might expect to find on the floor. There are no standards for lead in ventilation systems. After initially claiming that the lead would stay in the walls, the Board of Ed finally agreed to clean the ventilation system over the summer. During that cleanup, a group known as Concerned Stuyvesant Community had 2 segments of the auditorium carpet tested for asbestos using an unusually sensitive test called ultrasonication. The auditorium was the focus of particular concern, as it had been used as a triage center during the weeks that followed 9/11. One of the samples came back with a reading of 2.4 million structures per square centimeter, a level which, according to the independent experts whom Concerned Stuyvesant consulted, indisputably called for remediation. The carpet was replaced, the Board of Ed citing aesthetic reasons. There have been many illnesses. I go into detail. How many minutes? 3. Okay. There have been many illnesses already as a consequence of this exposure. New onset asthma among residents, over 50% of the Ground Zero workers, a larger number of the firefighters, 14 rescue dogs have died. But let me talk about something else first. In May of 2002, EPA instituted a cleanup program which was dangerously flawed. I won't go into detail unless you want to during the Q&A, except for 2 things. The normal goal during a cleanup of a Superfund site is 1 in a million extra cancers per contaminant. In the case of Lower Manhattan, EPA decided that the best they could shoot for was 1 in 10,000 extra cancers per contaminant. That's 100 times as many cancers as they usually aim for at Superfund sites. The second anomaly in EPA's treatment of Lower Manhattan, they relied on air tests for asbestos, whereas in their own building they relied on dust tests, which many experts agree are preferable, to determine that their building needed an asbestos abatement. In conclusion, the EPA's handling of 9/11 is not only a catastrophe for New Yorkers, it also bodes ill for the rest of the country, since it serves as a precedent for their response to analogous disasters in the future. As a New Yorker, I'd like to make this final comment. The way the Bush administration has responded to 9/11 strongly suggests that they are very pleased to use New York as a lightning rod to take more than its share of hits, yet get far less than its share of Homeland Security funding. At the same time, President Bush can use future attacks on New York to further his military and other aims. Thank you.